the Hyundai Crucifixion and Resurrection, the gas mileage debate and vehicle review. Here we shall present something a little different than the usual Gazdatronik video. As you may know, I do love synthesizers, but my interests also cover cars going way back to the early days of my life. I remember when Hyundai decided to step up their game in the automotive world a few years ago by taking what they had learned so far and applying some refinement and more striking styling. I also recall when they came under fire for reporting inaccurate gas mileage when advertising their vehicles. So when given the opportunity to test drive a 2014 Hyundai Elantra on a long trip, after some resignation, I figured that this would be an opportunity to figure out for myself what the real story was. Our trip was to be 361 odd miles to the Midwest, to the city of Dexter, Missouri. Population about 6,000. A city famous for being not famous at all. Heartland country, cornfields, wheat fields, and
beans, oh beans, lots of beans, lots of beans.
And yes, a video rental store. Things are a little behind the curve in Dexter. I looked up the fuel economy rating from the government website. 27 city, 37 highway. My personal goal was to get a minimum of 40 miles to the gallon on this trip, vindicating the bad press that the cars got. After all, if the custom cruiser can get 27 miles to the gallon highway with more than twice the displacement, 2 fewer transmission gears, extra weight, and all the modern engine technology of a grandfather clock, it was not unreasonable to expect 10 miles to the gallon better in the Hyundai. My pre-inspection of the test vehicle went as followed. It had 6,858 miles on the clock and a recent oil change. The tire pressures were good and the fluid levels were where they needed to be. Oh, wait, what's this? Uh-oh. It's not the 1.8 liter. It's the Limited, all right, but this one has the 2 liter engine. Well, what does the government website say about that configuration? 24 miles per gallon city and 35 highway. Well, that's not that good. I do realize the Elantra is considered a mid-sized, but its identity now seemed a bit odd. Let me explain. Some cars are good at getting great mileage, some are real lookers, some are cheap to buy, some are cheap to own, and some are luxurious. Some are great highway cruisers for the long-distance driver, and some have great handling. The Elantra doesn't seem to be any of these, at least on paper. On the ride from the pickup location to my house, there's a very winding road with tight turns and elevation changes, responsible for many wrecks over the years. When by myself, I would like to take my wife's 2000 Infiniti G20 automatic with 210,000 miles and thrash it around. The Hyundai is very similar in many ways. It seemed a bit quicker, probably due to the 6-speed transmission, but other than that, and their relative size, that's where the similarities ended. The handling was odd, and that's the nicest thing I can say about it. The seats were fairly firm, but offered no side bolstering at all. Around corners, the car would stop to a corner flat, and then suddenly and violently lurch over, throwing me around. The steering ratio was extremely fast and nauseating to get used to at first, and then afterward really annoying, as it required constant correction to keep the car on a straight heading. On the long trip, my arms became extremely fatigued, which is a first in my 14 years of driving cars. But as a plus, my back and legs felt just fine. Most seats I've experienced hurt these parts of my body, and I've always said take the worst car in the world and put a comfortable seat in it, and in my opinion, it will be twice as good. It has a lot of creature comforts. USB dock, auxiliary jack, satellite radio, heated seats, both the front and, for some insane reason, the rear. There were other symbols too, but I didn't really read up on what they did. It looked like it had a rear window defroster and a defogger, but even with the rain we experienced, I never had fogging problems with the windows, even though I didn't have any air directed to the windows. This meant I didn't have to run the air conditioner at any point during the trip, which was one of my goals. The 2 complaints about the entertainment system was that the steering wheel only changed preset stations, and you have to look at it in order to change folders on your USB stick. Everything I have ever used has a dedicated song skip and folder skip. On this model, you have to select the cat folding button and scroll through your choices. By the time your eyes were off the road long enough for the car to drift off of it, if you don't touch the steering wheel on a straight road in this car, it'll drift over to the shoulder line in 5 seconds. This Not an exaggeration, it was timed via my stopwatch. It'll hold the line for 5 seconds before it tries to sneakily kill you. In fact, in this car, I must have crossed over the ridge shoulder line about 30 times without meaning to, whereas in the custom cruiser, it's not really even necessary to steer. It's a problem that seems unique to this car, as I never really had any problems with that before. And it wasn't just me, my wife had the same complaints of the steering. Also, the headlights are not automatic. We drove stupidly into the dusk with the gauges lit and the sun was almost down before I realized there was even a problem. The daytime running lights shouldn't illuminate the gauge cluster. That was an unwise move on their design. Back seat room is decent, even with the kids' car seats. I had enough space to move my seat back for my very long legs. It can also be said that the average fuel economy is a little optimistic. However, it's still a useful tool for the driver to manage his driving style. If the numbers are going up, you are guaranteed to be using less fuel. The fuel tank of the car is about 12 gallons, and while that seems small, it should be more than enough for our trip if I can get at least 32 miles to the gallon, leaving a gallon for a safety margin. See, a lot of people don't realize that it's not the car that gets you your mileage. It's you, the driver. On this trip, I practiced the great anticipation driving style. It takes a minute to get used to, but it's a great automotive chess game if you can master it. The simple rules are as follows. No abrupt gas pedal motions. Remember to accelerate down hills, and when approaching an uphill grade, accelerate 10 to 15 miles an hour faster on the straight before the hill begins, and release the gas pedal to coast up the hill. Don't accelerate to overtake. Instead, change lanes. Quickly get into top gear and stay in top gear. Pick an engine RPM and try to stay under it. The Hyundai had an active eco button, and I have no idea what that did since it didn't seem any faster when it wasn't engaged, but I left it on anyway. Also, the auto stick allowed me to lock the car into 6th gear to avoid any unwanted downshifts. In 6th, the Elantra can do about 65 miles an hour, spinning at just under 2,000 RPM, which was my limit that I set for myself before we began the trip. My theory was that the questionable Hyundais in the past were getting bad gas mileage for the same reason that any other car would get bad mileage, and that's that the clueless drivers don't understand economical driving styles. I'm sorry, people, but driving 75 miles an hour with the air conditioning on, accelerating up hills, using the cruise control, and passing using the throttle is not going to save you a dime on gasoline. To prove this point, I would drive in such a real-world fashion on the way back home. Not aggressively, but more like the novice driver. 65 to 80 mile an hour cruising speeds, passing with the throttle when needed, not locking in top gear on the transmission. Although I would not have the air on because it was about 55 degrees outside. So, what was the result? On the way there, we refueled in Sikeston, Missouri, 337 miles into the trip, which at 8.207 gallons gives us 41.14 miles per gallon. That's even better than expected on the larger engine. On the way back though, after driving 24 miles from Sikeston to Dexter, driving around 42 miles in Dexter, and then driving 180 miles to Clarksville, Tennessee, we had to refuel. That was a total of 246 miles of mixed real-world driving, and through that, we used 7.888 gallons of gas. That totals up to only 31 miles to the gallon. Turn on the air conditioner for another couple of miles per gallon lost, and it's easy to see what the big fuss was about. But at least after this, I've proven my theory at least. The Hyundais are more than capable of obtaining their rated fuel economy and then some, but you gotta slow it down.